Ziegler stood in the observation gallery of the Galactic Council station, his forearms crossed in what his species considered a posture of patient boredom. Through the massive viewport, the blue and green world of Vex Prime rotated slowly below, a neutral meeting ground where 100 different species came to discuss matters of galactic importance. Today's matter, however, seemed far from important to him. Humans were petitioning for membership. In the Galactic Council, Ziegler had read the initial reports about this species when their primitive radio signals were first detected 30 cycles ago. They came from a small world they called Earth, tucked away in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy. The reports described them as bipedal mammals with only 2 arms, no natural armor, no venom, no telepathic abilities, and relatively short lifespans. They had barely achieved faster-than-light travel, and their weapons technology was crude by galactic standards. In short, they were unremarkable in every possible way. As a military observer for the Vraxian Empire, Ziegler had been assigned to evaluate these humans. His people were the galaxy's premier warriors, tall and powerful with scales that could deflect small arms fire and 4 arms that made them formidable in close combat. Every species in the council respected Vraxian military might. When the Vraxians spoke on matters of defense and warfare, others listened. The doors to the council chamber opened and Ziegler watched as 2 humans entered. They walked upright on 2 legs, moving with a peculiar grace that seemed almost fragile compared to the heavier gaits of most galactic species. Both wore simple dark blue uniforms with minimal decoration. The male human was tall for his species, with short brown hair graying at the temples. His face bore the lines of someone who smiled often, though at this moment his expression was serious and professional. The female human was shorter, with black hair pulled back severely, and her eyes seemed to take in every detail of the chamber with sharp intelligence. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," the male human said, his voice carrying clearly through the translation devices everyone wore. "I am Commander Jake Morrison, representing the United Earth Government. This is Lieutenant Amy Walsh, my tactical officer. We come before you in peace, seeking to join the community of spacefaring civilizations." High Chancellor Kelvin, an insectoid being from the core worlds, clicked his mandibles in what might have been amusement. "Your petition has been received, Commander Morrison. We have reviewed your technological assessments and cultural data. Tell us, what does humanity bring to the Galactic Council that the other 467 member species do not already provide?" Ziegler saw the slight tightening around the human's eyes. The question was almost insulting in its directness, but Morrison handled it with grace. "We bring perspective, Chancellor," Morrison replied. "We've studied your histories, your cultures, your achievements. We see patterns of cooperation and mutual benefit. Earth may be small, and our technology may be behind yours, but we've survived and thrived on a world that tried very hard to kill us. We've learned to adapt, to persist, and to work together despite our differences. We believe these qualities have value." Several council members made sounds of polite interest, though Ziegler could tell they were not impressed. He had heard similar speeches from dozens of species seeking membership. They all claimed to bring something unique. They all believed they were special. A representative from the Caltharian Unity, a methane-breathing species in an environmental suit, spoke next. "Your world has experienced over 300 significant conflicts in your recorded history. You wage war upon yourselves with disturbing regularity. How can the Council trust a species that cannot even maintain peace among its own kind?" Lieutenant Walsh spoke for the first time. "With respect, Representative, we don't hide from our history. Yes, we've fought wars. We've made terrible mistakes, but we've also learned from them. Our world is united now, not because we eliminated our differences, but because we learned that our differences make us stronger. Every time we fell, we got back up. Every time we failed, we tried again. That persistence, that refusal to give up, that's what we offer." Ziegler made a note in his datapad. The humans seemed to place great importance on these abstract concepts: persistence, unity despite differences, getting back up after falling. These were poetic ideas, perhaps, but Ziegler wondered how they translated to practical value. In his experience, warfare was about strength, tactics, and superior firepower. Poetry did not win battles. The session continued for another hour. The humans answered questions about their military capabilities, their resource production, their scientific achievements. On every metric, they were average or below average compared to other species. Their ships were slower. Their weapons were weaker. Their industrial capacity was modest. Yet something about the way they carried themselves intrigued Ziegler despite his skepticism. They did not grovel or exaggerate their achievements. They met each question with honest, direct answers. When they did not know something, they admitted it freely. When their capabilities were found lacking, they did not make excuses. "You claim your species values individual life highly," another council member said. "Yet your military records show that your soldiers often take extreme risks. Is this not a contradiction?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "We value every life, which is exactly why our soldiers take those risks. We have a saying on Earth, no one gets left behind. If one of our people is in danger, others will risk everything to save them. Not because it's tactically sound, but because it's right. Because that person matters. Because if we won't fight for each other, what are we fighting for?" Several council members exchanged glances. Ziegler could sense their confusion. Most galactic militaries operated on principles of calculated loss. A commander who risked many to save few would be considered incompetent. The idea of endangering multiple soldiers to rescue one seemed illogical. High Chancellor Kelvin finally spoke again. "The council will deliberate on your petition. You may wait in the guest quarters." The two humans bowed slightly and left the chamber. The moment the doors closed, the council erupted in quiet discussion. "They seem harmless enough," one representative said. "Weak," another agreed. "But perhaps useful for labor or resource extraction from their system." "I find their emotional attachment to individuals troubling," a third added. "It suggests an inability to make difficult tactical decisions." Ziegler listened to the discussions and felt a strange sense of disappointment. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that these humans might be interesting. Instead, they appeared to be exactly what the reports suggested, average in every way, with peculiar emotional attachments that would likely prove to be weaknesses in any real conflict. The vote was called. The council granted humanity provisional membership, as expected. The humans were not threatening enough to exclude, and their system did contain some useful trade resources. They would be welcomed, studied, and eventually forgotten like so many other minor species. As the session ended, Ziegler received his new assignment. He was to be attached to human military forces as a permanent observer. The council wanted detailed reports on human military capabilities, training methods, and tactical doctrine. It was considered a light assignment, perhaps even a boring one. Observing a species with outdated weapons and strange, emotional attachment to their soldiers would hardly be challenging work. Ziegler accepted the assignment with the appropriate formal acknowledgments. Though inside he felt a flicker of annoyance. He was a Vraxian warrior, trained in the finest military academies, veteran of 6 campaigns. Now he would be babysitting primitive humans, who probably could not even properly hold a battle formation, he found. Commander Morrison in the observation gallery later that evening. The human stood alone, looking out at the stars. "Commander," Ziegler said, announcing his presence. "I am Ziegler of the Vraxian Empire. I have been assigned as military observer to your forces." Morrison turned and smiled, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Ziegler awkwardly took the hand with one of his forearms, noting how small and fragile it felt. "Observer Ziegler," Morrison said warmly. "Welcome. I hope you'll find us interesting to study." "I hope so as well," Ziegler replied, trying to keep the doubt from his voice. "I have read your military specifications. Your technology is somewhat behind galactic standards." Morrison's smile did not fade. "That's true. We're new to all this. But we learn fast and we don't give up easily. I think you'll find we're full of surprises." Ziegler nodded politely, though he did not believe it. He had served in militaries across the galaxy. He had seen every type of warrior, every kind of fighting style, every variation of tactics and strategy. These humans, with their outdated ships and their strange ideas about never leaving anyone behind, would not surprise him. They were just another minor species, trying to find their place in a galaxy that had been functioning perfectly well without them. He had no idea how wrong he was, Daz. Ziegler looked out at the stars beside the human commander. He felt certain of one thing: this assignment would be short, uneventful, and forgettable. He would file his reports, note their adequate but unremarkable capabilities, and eventually be reassigned to something. 6 months had passed since Ziegler began his assignment with human forces, and he had spent most of that time being thoroughly unimpressed. He stood now on the observation deck of the human colony world called New Haven, watching yet another training exercise in the valley below. The human soldiers moved through their drills with reasonable precision. They practiced building defensive positions, coordinating fire teams, and responding to simulated enemy attacks. By galactic standards, they were adequate. Nothing more, nothing less. Their weapons were still outdated, their armor was lighter than most species preferred, and their tactics were conventional to the point of being predictable. What did impress Ziegler, though he would not admit it in his reports, was their obsessive dedication to training. The humans trained constantly. Every single day, without exception. They ran physical conditioning exercises that left them exhausted. They practiced weapons drills until their movements became automatic. They simulated battle scenarios over and over, analyzing every mistake, refining every action. "Why do you train so much?" Ziegler had asked Captain Ryan Blake, the garrison commander. Just last week, Blake had looked at him with those strange human eyes, green like the earth forests Ziegler had seen in images. "Because when the real thing happens, we don't want to have to think. We want our training to take over. Thinking gets you killed. Training keeps you alive." It was a reasonable answer, Ziegler supposed, though it still seemed excessive. The Vraxians trained regularly, of course, but they relied more on their natural physical advantages and centuries of accumulated tactical knowledge. Captain Blake climbed the stairs to the observation deck, carrying 2 containers of that bitter coffee drink humans seemed addicted to. He was a solidly built man with short blonde hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. In the 6 months Ziegler had observed him, he had seen Blake smile exactly 3 times, and never during duty hours. "Observer," Blake said, offering one of the containers. "Thoughts on today's exercise?" Ziegler had learned to tolerate the coffee, though he still did not understand its appeal. He took the container with one hand. "Your soldiers performed adequately. Their response time to the simulated ambush was acceptable." "Acceptable," Blake repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "That's high praise from you." Before Ziegler could respond, an alarm sounded throughout the base. Both of them immediately looked to the command center below, where officers were suddenly moving with urgent purpose. "All senior personnel to command immediately," a voice announced over the base communication system. "Priority alert? This is not a drill." Blake was already moving, and Ziegler followed. Whatever had triggered a priority alert, his duty as observer required him to witness it. The command center was organized chaos when they arrived. Holographic displays showed star charts and fleet movements. Junior officers were speaking rapidly into communication devices. Lieutenant Amy Walsh, who had been assigned to New Haven as tactical coordinator, stood at the central display with her face set in grim lines. "Report," Blake said. Moving to stand beside her, Walsh pointed to the holographic display. "Long-range sensors detected a massive fleet entering the sector 2 hours ago. We've been analyzing their signatures and cross-referencing with galactic databases." "Captain, it's the Cathon horde." The room fell silent. Ziegler felt his scales tighten involuntarily. The Catharn were known throughout the galaxy as brutal raiders who took no prisoners and left nothing but ash in their wake. They had conquered 17 systems in the last 5 years, and the Galactic Council's response had been to evacuate and cede territory. Rather than face them in open battle, the Catharn were not a species that could be reasoned with or negotiated with. They simply destroyed everything they encountered. "How many ships?" Blake asked, his voice steady despite the dire news. 12 capital ships, plus support vessels. They're moving through the sector, destroying everything. Preliminary projections have them reaching New Haven in approximately 72 hours. What are the Council's orders? Blake asked. Walsh glanced at Ziegler before answering. Immediate evacuation of all personnel and civilians. We're to abandon the colony and fall back to the core systems. Blake studied the display in silence. New Haven was home to 50,000 colonists, most of them families who had been here for less than 2 years. The colony had farms, schools, and homes that people had built with their own hands. It was not just a military outpost. It was a community. How long would a full evacuation take? Blake asked. At least a week, sir, another officer replied. We have transport capacity for maybe 20,000 at a time. We'd need 3 trips, and that's if everything goes perfectly. Which means we don't have time, Walsh said quietly. The Catharn will be here before we can get everyone out. Blake nodded slowly, still staring at the display. Then he did something that made Ziegler's blood run cold. Transmit a message to Fleet Command, Blake said. New Haven Garrison respectfully declines evacuation orders. We will defend the colony and protect the civilian population. Every human in the room turned to stare at their commander. Walsh stepped closer, lowering her voice. Captain, we have 3 outdated cruisers against 12 Catharn capital ships. The math doesn't work. This isn't a battle we can win. Blake turned to face her, and his expression was harder than Ziegler had ever seen it. We're not abandoning 50,000 people, Lieutenant. We took an oath to protect them. That means something. It means we'll all die, Walsh said, and Ziegler noted that her voice was not argumentative, merely stating a fact. Maybe, Blake agreed. But we'll die doing our duty. Get me a line to all colony personnel. I need to explain the situation. Ziegler could not stay silent any longer. Captain Blake, this is madness. The logical course of action is evacuation. You cannot fight the Catharn with 3 ships. Blake turned to look at him, and Ziegler saw something in the human's eyes that he had never seen before. It was not anger or fear. It was absolute certainty. Observer, you're free to request evacuation if you wish. I won't stop you. But we're staying. You will all die for nothing, Ziegler insisted. The Catharn cannot be defeated by such a small force. Then we'll make them pay for every inch, Blake said simply. Lieutenant Walsh, get me that communication line. Within the hour, every human on New Haven knew the situation. Ziegler had expected panic, perhaps even mutiny against Blake's suicidal decision. Instead, he witnessed something that defied his understanding of rational behavior. The colonists began fortifying their homes. Civilians with no military training lined up at the armory to receive weapons and basic instruction. Parents sent their children to underground shelters and then joined the militia formations. Old men and women who had not fired a weapon in decades took positions on the defensive lines. Corporal Lisa Grant was a squad leader in the Garrison Marines. She was a short woman with red hair and more freckles than Ziegler had ever seen on a human face. She could not have been more than 25 cycles old. He found her supervising the construction of defensive barricades in the colony's central square. Corporal Grant, Ziegler said, approaching her. You understand the situation? The Catharn fleet vastly outnumbers your forces. Grant looked up from the tactical tablet she had been studying. Yes, sir. We're outnumbered about 4-to-1 in space, and once they land troops, probably 10-to-1 on the ground. Then why are you smiling? Grant glanced down at her mouth, as if surprised to find she was indeed smiling. I guess because I'm scared as hell, observer. But I'm also proud. Not many people get to be part of something like this. Part of what? A massacre? Part of standing up when you're supposed to run, Grant said. Part of fighting for people who can't fight for themselves? My grandfather told me stories about Earth's old wars. about times when small groups held off larger forces because they were fighting for their homes. We're going to do the same thing. Your grandfather's stories were about victories, Ziegler pointed out. This will not be a victory. Maybe not, Grant agreed, returning to her work. But it'll be one hell of a fight. And those colonists down in the shelters will know that someone stood for them. That matters. Ziegler retreated to his quarters and immediately sent a message to his Vraxian superiors, requesting permission to evacuate. The response came within an hour. Denied. He was ordered to remain and observe. The council wanted detailed information on how humans conducted themselves in the face of certain defeat. The next 72 hours were a blur of preparation. The 3 human cruisers designated as the Providence, the Endeavor, and the Liberty were readied for battle. Their crews worked around the clock to maximize every weapon system, reinforcing shields and loading every last missile on the ground. The Marines and militia established overlapping fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, and stockpiled ammunition. Medical facilities were expanded and stocked with supplies. The colonists' children, safe in the underground shelters, were taught songs to keep them calm. Ziegler watched it all with a mixture of fascination and horror. These humans knew they were about to die, and yet they worked with purpose and determination. They joked with each other during breaks. They checked on their friends' emotional state, and they made sure everyone had. The Catharn fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the new Haven system like a pack of predators entering a killing ground. Their 12 capital ships were massive and brutal in design, all sharp angles and heavy armor plating. Support vessels swarmed around them like insects around a corpse. Ziegler stood on the bridge of the Providence, the flagship of the small human defense fleet. Captain Blake commanded from the center seat, his face calm despite the overwhelming odds displayed on the tactical screens. Lieutenant Walsh was at the weapons console, her fingers moving across the controls with practiced efficiency. "Enemy fleet is moving into attack formation," Walsh reported. "They're not even trying to hail us or demand surrender." "The Catharn don't do surrender," Blake said. "They just kill. All ships, this is Providence Actual. Weapons free. Make every shot count." The 3 human cruisers moved forward to meet the Catharn fleet. Ziegler wanted to scream at them to fall back, to at least try to extend the battle, but he remained silent. He was an observer. This was not his fight. The Catharn opened fire first. Massive plasma bolts streaked across the void, and the Providence's shields flared as they absorbed the impact. The ship shuddered beneath Ziegler's feet, and alarms began wailing throughout the bridge. "Shields at 70%, a human officer called out. Forward batteries returning fire. The Providence and her sister ships launched everything they had. Missiles spiraled through space-trailing exhaust. Energy beams carved through the darkness. The humans had outdated weapons, but they were using them with impressive coordination. 2 Catharn support vessels exploded in brilliant fireballs. A third listed to the side, venting atmosphere. But the Catharn capital ships barely seemed to notice the damage. They advanced steadily, their superior shields easily handling the human weapons fire. "This is Endeavor," a voice crackled over the communication system. "We've lost main power. Shields are failing." Ziegler watched the tactical display as one of the human cruisers went dark, dead in space and helpless. 3 Catharn ships immediately moved to finish it off. "Endeavor crew, abandon ship," Blake ordered. "Get to the escape pods now." "Negative, Providence," the Endeavor's captain replied. His voice was strangely calm. "We've still got maneuvering thrusters and a reactor that's about to go critical. Transmitting final data logs now." "It's been an honor, sir." Ziegler realized what was happening a moment before it occurred. The Endeavor, powerless and doomed, used its last maneuvering thrust to point itself directly at the nearest Catharn capital ship and accelerated. The Catharn tried to change course, but they were too slow. The Endeavor crashed into their hull at tremendous speed, and its reactor detonated on impact. The explosion was so bright that the Providence's view screen automatically dimmed. When it cleared, both ships were gone. Reduced to expanding clouds of debris, the Endeavor's entire crew, more than 300 humans, had just chosen to die rather than let their disabled ship become useless wreckage. Holy hell, Walsh whispered. They actually did it. Blake's jaw was tight, but his voice remained steady. Honor their sacrifice. All ships, continue engagement. Take out as many as you can. The battle continued with brutal intensity. The Liberty destroyed 2 more Catharn support vessels before taking a direct hit to its engine section. The ship began spinning out of control, but its weapons kept firing even as it tumbled through space. Liberty is breaking up, Walsh reported, her voice cracking slightly. I'm reading multiple hull breaches. They're venting atmosphere. Liberty actual, report status, Blake called. The response was broken by static and the sound of alarms. This is Lieutenant Commander Nathan Price. Captain's dead. Half the crew is dead? But we're not done yet. The Liberty's spin brought its weapons around to face a Catharn capital ship at point-blank range. Every remaining weapon system fired simultaneously, overwhelming the Catharn-S shields and punching through their armor. Explosions rippled across the enemy ship's hull. Then the Liberty's reactor went critical, and it too became a funeral pyre for its crew and the Catharn ship it had killed. Now only the Providence remained, surrounded by 11 Catharn ships. We're not going to make it, are we? A young human officer asked, and Ziegler was struck by how steady his voice was despite the obvious fear in his eyes. No, Blake said honestly, but we're going to hurt them before we go, and we bought the ground forces time to prepare. That's what matters. The Catharn focused all their fire on the Providence. The shields collapsed within seconds. Hull breaches appeared throughout the ship. Ziegler grabbed onto a support rail as the artificial gravity fluctuated. All hands, abandon ship, Blake ordered. Get to the escape pods. That's an order. Most of the crew obeyed, running for the escape pods as the ship died around them. But Walsh remained at her station, still firing weapons. Blake remained in his command chair, and a handful of other crew members stayed at critical positions, keeping the ship functional for a few more precious seconds. You're not leaving? Ziegler asked Blake, confused by this suicidal decision. Blake smiled grimly. Someone needs to make sure this ship hits something important before it blows. Besides, there aren't enough escape pods for everyone. Captain goes down with the ship. It's tradition. A Catharn boarding pod slammed into the Providence's hull near the bridge. Alarms screamed warnings about hull breach and hostile boarding parties. They're trying to capture the ship, Walsh said. Probably want the database and tactical information. Then let's make sure they don't get it, Blake said. He drew a sidearm from his belt and tossed another to Walsh. Set the self-destruct. 5-minute timer. Walsh's fingers flew across the console. Self-destruct armed. 5 minutes. Ziegler heard the sounds of fighting in the corridors outside the bridge. Energy weapons fired. Humans screamed battle cries. The Catharn roared their inhuman war calls. The bridge doors exploded inward and Catharn warriors poured through. They were massive creatures, easily twice the height of a human, covered in thick chitin armor and wielding weapons that looked more like slabs of metal than rifles. Blake and Walsh opened fire immediately. Their small weapons barely slowed the Catharn down, but they kept shooting. A human engineer appeared from a side corridor and tackled one of the Catharn warriors. The warrior was 5 times his size, but the human had grabbed some kind of plasma torch and was using it like a weapon. Ziegler recognized him. Pete Carter, a civilian cargo handler who had volunteered to help during the battle. He had no military training, no combat experience, and yet here he was fighting a Catharn warrior with improvised weapons. Another Catharn warrior raised its weapon to shoot. Carter in the back. Without thinking, Ziegler drew his own sidearm and fired. The shot took the warrior in the eye, dropping it instantly. Carter looked back, saw Ziegler, and grinned through a face covered in blood. Thanks, buddy. Then more Catharn poured through the door, and everything became chaos. Blake went down, shot through the chest. Walsh screamed in rage and emptied her weapon into his killer before being struck by a massive Cathorn fist that sent her flying across the bridge. Ziegther fired again and again, his military training taking over. Until his weapon clicked empty, a Cathorn warrior advanced on him, raising its weapon to deliver a killing blow. Ziegther prepared for death, and found himself thinking how strange it was that he would die defending humans. Carter appeared again, somehow still alive, and sprayed the Cathorn warrior with his plasma torch. The warrior roared in pain and swatted Carter aside like an insect, but the distraction was enough. Ziegther rolled aside, grabbed a fallen Cathorn weapon, and fired point-blank into the warrior's exposed neck joint. The Cathorn fleet commander must have realized the Providence was rigged to explode, because suddenly the warriors were retreating. They dragged their wounded with them and fled back to their boarding pod. Ziegther staggered to the self-destruct console. 2 minutes remaining. He looked around at the devastation. Blake was dead, his eyes still open, still staring at the tactical display. Walsh was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Carter was trying to drag her toward an escape pod. "Go!" Ziegther shouted at him. "I'll get her." "Like hell," Carter gasped. "Nobody gets left behind." Together they hauled Walsh's limp form through the corridors. Behind them, they could hear the Cathorn pod detaching from the hull. The ship shuddered and groaned around them. 1 minute. They reached an escape pod and shoved Walsh inside. Carter climbed in after her. Ziegther followed, and Carter slammed the launch button. The pod shot away from the Providence just as the timer reached 0. The explosion that followed was massive, consuming the Providence and catching 2 Cathorn ships that had moved too close. The blast wave sent their pod tumbling through space, and Ziegther's last thought before losing consciousness was how much that human engineer had risked for people he barely knew. When Ziegther woke, he was on New Haven's surface in an emergency medical facility. The Cathorn fleet had moved into orbit and was beginning to land troops. The second phase of the battle was about to begin, and Ziegther finally understood what Blake had meant. He had seen humans choose death over retreat. He had seen them sacrifice themselves to protect others. He had seen a civilian cargo handler fight a... The medical facility had been transformed into a fortress. Sandbags blocked windows, automated turrets watched the approaches, and every person inside who could hold a weapon had one. Ziegther stood near what had been the reception area. Now, a hardened defensive position where Corporal Lisa Grant was directing her squad through the reinforced windows. Ziegther could see Cathorn dropships descending through New Haven's atmosphere like falling meteors. Each ship carried at least 100 warriors, and dozens were landing across the colony. The Cathorn had overwhelming numerical superiority, superior weapons, and centuries of experience crushing resistance. By every tactical calculation Ziegther knew, the humans should have surrendered the moment the first dropship touched down. Instead, they opened fire. The entire colony erupted in defensive fire. Weapons positions that had seemed randomly placed revealed themselves as overlapping fields of fire. Every approach to the civilian shelters was covered by at least 3 different firing positions. The humans had turned their home into a killing ground. "First wave incoming," Grant called to her squad. "Remember your training. Short controlled bursts. Pick your targets. Don't waste ammunition." Her squad consisted of 9 Marines, most of them barely older than 20 cycles. They positioned themselves at windows and doorways, weapons ready. Ziegther noticed their hands were steady, despite the fear he could see in their eyes. "Corporal," one of the younger soldiers said. "There's so many of them." "Then we won't run out of targets," Grant replied with that mad human humor. "Stay focused, Charlie. We've got this." The first Cathorn warriors reached the medical facility's perimeter. They moved in organized formations, using their natural armor and shields to advance steadily. Each warrior stood over 2 meters tall and carried weapons that could punch through concrete. "Fire!" Grant ordered. The human weapons opened up as one. Compared to the massive Cathorn guns, they sounded almost insignificant. Small cracks instead of thunderous booms. But the humans aimed with precision, focusing their fire on weak points in the Cathorn armor. Joints, eye slits. Gaps in their protective plating, 2 Cathorn went down in the first volley. Then 3 more. The formation faltered as warriors stumbled and fell. "Reloading," one of the Marines called. "I've got you covered," another responded immediately. Increasing his rate of fire to compensate. Zek single quotes Thor watched in fascination. Every movement was coordinated. When one human needed to reload, others covered them. When someone spotted a threat, they called it out to the whole squad. They moved like a single organism, each part supporting the others. A Cathorn warrior broke through the perimeter and charged the building. It was massive, armed with a blade that looked like it could cut through steel, and it roared a challenge that shook the walls. Grant stepped into the doorway and fired 3 precise shots. The first hit the warrior's knee joint, making it stumble. The second hit its throat. The third hit its eye. The Cathorn collapsed less than 5 meters from the entrance. "Nice shooting, Corporal," Charlie said. "Save the compliments for after we win," Grant replied. But Ziegler saw the slight smile on her face. The battle continued for hours. Wave after wave of Cathorn attacked the medical facility and other defensive positions throughout the colony. The humans gave ground slowly, falling back to prepared positions. Making the Cathorn pay for every meter. During a brief lull in the fighting, Ziegler found himself sitting beside Pete Carter, the cargo handler who had saved his life on the Providence. Carter was bandaging a wound on his arm, seemingly unconcerned by the battle raging outside. "Why did you save me?" Ziegler asked. "On the ship. You had no tactical reason to risk yourself for an observer." Carter looked up, surprised by the question. "You were crew. That's reason enough. But I am not human. I am not even part of your military." Carter shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You were with us when things got bad. That makes you one of us. We don't leave people behind, observer. Not even grumpy alien military observers who think we're primitive." Despite everything, Ziegler felt something that might have been humor. "I never said you were primitive." "You didn't have to," Carter said with a grin. "Your face said it loud enough. But that's okay. You're learning." An explosion rocked the building. Dust fell from the ceiling. Someone shouted that the Cathorn were breaching the west wall. Carter grabbed his improvised plasma torch and headed toward the breach. "Duty calls. Try not to die, observer. I don't want to have saved you for nothing." The breach became a desperate close-quarters fight. Cathorn warriors poured through the gap, and humans met them with rifles, grenades, and sheer determination. Ziegler found himself fighting alongside soldiers and civilians. All of them united in defense of the medical facility. A human medic named Helen Ross moved through the chaos, treating wounded even as battles raged around her. She was a small woman with gray hair and gentle hands, and she seemed utterly fearless. When a wounded Marine went down near the breach, she ran into the open to drag him to safety. A Cathorn warrior spotted her and raised its weapon. Ziegler shot it before it could fire, his military training overriding his role as observer. Ross looked back at him, nodded thanks, and continued treating the wounded Marine without missing a beat. "You're getting better at this," Grant said, appearing beside him. Her uniform was torn and she was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was still smiling. "For an observer. I am no longer simply observing," Ziegler admitted. "Yeah, well, welcome to humanity. We have a way of making people care." The Cathorn assault intensified. More warriors poured through the breach. The human defensive line began to buckle under the pressure. Ziegler could see they were being overwhelmed. "Fall back to secondary positions," Grant ordered. "Everyone who can walk, help the wounded. Nobody stays behind." That phrase again. Nobody stays behind. Ziegler had heard it dozens of times now, and each time it resulted in humans taking enormous risks to rescue each other as they fell back. Ziegler saw Grant pause to help a wounded Marine who had been shot in both legs. 2 Cathorn warriors were closing on their position. "Corporal, leave him," Charlie shouted. "You can't carry him in time." Grant ignored the order. She slung the wounded Marine over her shoulders and started running. Ziegler and 3 other soldiers laid down covering fire, forcing the Cathorn to take cover. Grant made it to the secondary position, delivered the wounded Marine to the medics, and immediately returned to fighting. That was tactically unsound, Ziegler told her when he got close enough. Probably, Grant agreed, reloading her weapon. But that's Danny. He's got a wife and a baby girl. They're down in the shelters. I'm not going to let him die when I can prevent it. You could have died trying to save him. Grant looked at him with those human eyes that seemed to contain depths of emotion Zek. Thor did not fully understand. Observer, if I'm not willing to die for my people, what kind of leader am I? What kind of person? The battle raged on through the day and into the night. The Catharn controlled most of the colony now, but the humans held the critical areas around the civilian shelters. Every attempt to breach those defenses met fierce resistance. Ziegler kept fighting, and somewhere in the chaos he stopped thinking of himself as an observer. He became part of the defense, part of the desperate struggle to protect people he had considered beneath him only months ago. When dawn came, the Catharn suddenly withdrew. Their remaining ships lifted off from the surface and regrouped in orbit. Ziegler did not understand why until Grant explained. We hurt them, she said, leaning heavily against a wall. We hurt them so badly that they're not sure they can win. The Catharn have never retreated from a ground assault before. But they just did. The cost had been terrible. Nearly 3,000 humans were dead. Every defensive position was damaged or destroyed. The colony itself was in ruins, but the civilian shelters remained secure, and the Catharn were withdrawing. Captain Ryan Blake's prediction had been wrong. The humans had not all died. They had won, at least partially. They had done the impossible. Ziegler stood among the human survivors, covered in dust and blood, and realized he needed to make a report to the Galactic Council. But he had no idea how to explain what he had witnessed. How could he make them understand that humans did not fight according to rational tactics? That they refused to accept losses that any other species would consider inevitable? That they drew strength from irrational concepts like loyalty and sacrifice? Dr. Helen Ross found him in what remained of the medical facility. She looked exhausted, having been treating wounded for almost 24 hours straight. But her hands were still steady as she cleaned and bandaged a cut on Ziegler's arm that he had not even noticed receiving. You fought well, observer, she said quietly. Thank you for standing with us. I do not understand your species, Ziegler admitted. You should have retreated. You should have evacuated. Everything about this battle was tactically unsound. Ross smiled tiredly. Maybe, but we're still here. Our people are still safe. Sometimes the tactically unsound choice is the right one. Why? Ziegler asked. Why do you value individual lives so highly? Why risk many to save few? Ross paused in her work, considering the question. Because the moment we start calculating which lives are worth saving and which aren't, we stop. 1 year had passed since the Battle of New Haven, and the galaxy was burning. The Catharn horde, emboldened by their near victory against the humans, had expanded their campaign. They swept through the Outer Rim like a plague, conquering system after system. The Galactic Council's response remained what it had always been: strategic withdrawal, calculated losses, defensive positioning that slowly gave ground. 12 species had fallen completely. 23 others had lost significant territory. The Catharn were no longer just raiders. They had become an existential threat to galactic civilization. Ziegler stood in the Grand Council chamber on the core world of Zentari Prime, watching the assembled representatives debate their options. He wore the uniform of a Vraxian military observer, but now he also carried an additional insignia, liaison to human forces. It was an unusual position, created specifically for him after his experiences on New Haven. We must negotiate, the representative from the Caltharian Unity was saying. Offer them the outer territories in exchange for peace. Appeasement will only encourage them, another council member argued. We need to consolidate our fleets and establish a defensive line they cannot cross. Zek. Thor listened to them debate the same tired strategies they had used for decades: retreat, consolidate, minimize losses. accept partial defeat to avoid total defeat. It was logical, reasonable, and utterly inadequate against an enemy like the K single quotes to HARN. He thought about Captain Ryan Blake, who had refused to retreat even when ordered, about the Providence's crew, who had chosen to ram their disabled ship rather than let it fall into enemy hands, about Corporal Lisa Grant, carrying a wounded Marine through enemy fire because nobody gets left behind. The humans had a different approach to warfare, and the galaxy desperately needed to learn it. Honored council members, Ziegler said, rising to his feet. The chamber fell silent. It was highly irregular for a military observer to speak during council sessions. Hi. Chancellor Kelvin's mandibles clicked in what might have been annoyance or interest. Observer Ziegler, you have something to contribute? I have a recommendation, Ziegler said carefully. Request military assistance from the human expeditionary forces. A wave of murmurs spread through the chamber. Several representatives made sounds of disbelief or amusement. The humans? One representative said, their technology is inferior. Their fleet is small. What could they possibly offer that our combined forces do not already possess? Ziegler had prepared for this response. He had spent months analyzing battle data, studying human military doctrine, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. Now he stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and tried to explain something they had never encountered. What the humans offer is not superior technology or greater numbers, Ziegler said. What they offer is a different approach to warfare entirely. The Council fights to minimize losses. The Catharn fight to maximize destruction. But humans fight to win, regardless of cost. They refuse to accept defeat even when it is inevitable. And somehow that refusal changes what is inevitable. You describe recklessness, another council member said. Tactical irrationality. I describe effectiveness, Ziegler countered. He activated a holographic display showing the Battle of New Haven. The humans faced 12 Catharn capital ships with only 3 outdated cruisers. Every tactical analysis predicted complete defeat within hours. Yet the humans destroyed 6 Catharn ships and forced the remainder to retreat. They lost 3,000 soldiers defending 50,000 civilians. Any other species would have evacuated and ceded the territory. The humans held their ground and won. High Chancellor Kelvin studied the data with his compound eyes. One battle does not prove a pattern, observer. And I have read your reports. The human victory came at tremendous cost. Yes, Ziegler agreed. But they considered it an acceptable cost because they saved what they valued most, the people they were sworn to protect. That is the critical difference. We calculate acceptable losses based on strategic value. Humans calculate acceptable losses based on what they are fighting for. And they will accept any loss, including their own lives, if it means protecting others. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then the representative from the Vraxian Empire stood. Ziegler recognized him as War Commander Thexonar, one of the highest-ranking military officials in the galaxy. Observer Ziegler's analysis has merit, Thexonar said. I have reviewed all available data on human combat performance. While their tactics appear irrational, their results are undeniable. More importantly, the Catharn have never retreated from a ground assault until they faced humans. That alone warrants further investigation. The debate continued for another hour, but Ziegler could sense the shift in the chamber. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the council was finally afraid enough to consider unconventional solutions. The vote was called. The motion passed by a narrow margin. The Galactic Council would officially request military assistance from the United Earth Government. 3 weeks later, Admiral Karen Hughes arrived at Centauri Prime with the human expeditionary fleet. Ziegler was waiting at the docking station when she disembarked. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Her uniform was simple and functional, with none of the elaborate decorations that most galactic military leaders favored. Admiral Hughes, Ziegler said, giving the formal Vraxian salute. Welcome to Centauri Prime. Hughes returned the salute with the casual human gesture. Observer Ziegler, I've read your reports about New Haven, hell of a thing you went through. It was educational, Ziegler said carefully. The Council is eager to discuss strategy with you. I bet they are, Hughes said with a slight smile. They're losing, and they're desperate enough to call in the species they considered primitive a year ago. Let's go see what we can do to help. The strategy session that followed was unlike anything Ziegler had witnessed in his military career. The Council's military leaders presented their defensive plans, their calculations of acceptable losses, their proposals for strategic withdrawals. Hughes listened politely to all of it, and then she said one word that changed everything. No, High Chancellor Kelvin S. Mandibles clicked in confusion. No, Admiral, we are presenting you with the consensus strategy of the galaxy's finest military minds. I understand that, Hughes said calmly. And your strategy is going to get you all killed. You're fighting a defensive war against an enemy that only understands offense. Every time you retreat, you give them more territory, more resources, more confidence. You need to stop retreating and start attacking. Attacking? A Caltharian military advisor said. Admiral, the Catharn outnumber our forces 3-1. Then we'll have to be smarter than them, Hughes replied. Observer Ziegler told you that humans fight to win, not to minimize losses. Let me explain what that means in practical terms. We're not going to establish defensive lines. We're going to go straight to the Catharn staging areas and destroy their ability to wage war. She brought up a star chart showing Catharn-controlled territory. Here, the sanctuary system. Intelligence suggests this is where the Catharn are consolidating their fleet for a final push against your core worlds. You want to set up defenses and wait for them to attack. I say we hit them while they're still organizing. That's suicide, someone said. Hughes smiled, and Ziegler recognized that smile. It was the same expression he had seen on Captain Blake's face before the Battle of New Haven, the smile of someone who had decided that impossible odds were just another challenge to overcome. Maybe, Hughes said. Or maybe it's exactly what we need to do. The Catharn have never faced an opponent who attacked their home territory. They're used to hunting prey, not being hunted. Let's show them what happens when the prey becomes the predator. 2 weeks later, Ziegler found himself on the bridge of the human flagship, the Constitution, as it led a combined fleet toward the sanctuary system. The fleet was smaller than the Council's military leaders had wanted, but Hughes had insisted on speed and surprise over overwhelming force. Captain Ryan Blake was also aboard. Promoted to Strategic Operations Commander after his performance at New Haven, his face still had that same hard-carved look, though Ziegler now understood it was not coldness but determination. Nervous, observer? Blake asked as they approached the Catharn system. I have been in many battles, Ziegler replied. But never one where we deliberately sought out a superior enemy force. Welcome to the human approach to warfare, Blake said with grim amusement. We don't wait for the enemy to come to us. We take the fight to them. The combined fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the sanctuary system. The sensors immediately detected the Catharn fleet, over 40 capital ships, plus hundreds of support vessels, all concentrated around a massive space station. All ships. This is Admiral Hughes, the Admiral's voice came over the communication system. Remember your training. We're not here to trade shots with them. We're here to break them. Hit hard, hit fast, and make them regret ever leaving their home systems. The fleet split into 3 groups, each targeting a different section of the Catharn formation. The human ships led each group, their smaller size and greater maneuverability allowing them to dart through the Catharn